Who was that you were talking about? I hardly recognize that introduction, and I just wrote it yesterday. I had occasion to see Stephen King give a lecture about 4 years ago, and he came out on the stage and popped open a can of beer. So I brought with me skim milk, which is the only difference between us. Stephen King spent most of the time just lamenting that the American reader didn't think he was William Faulkner. So it's hard to appreciate the man who was making $2 million a week. Hard to appreciate his sadness. Happy to be back. I was here last year, and afterwards I went outside to sign autographs. That took maybe 30 seconds. And a woman came up to me from this group, and she said, I read your last book, the one before, Ort Brand. And she says, it changed my life. It's a true story. I only tell true stories. They don't sound true, but they're true stories. And I said, how's that? She said, well, before I read it, I was going to kill my husband. And after I read it, I decided to divorce him. So I had a profound influence on her life, as I'm sure I will have on your life, so, and protect your husbands anyway from being murdered. We're here today to talk about stories, mostly. The value of story, the value of storytelling. And I'm going to tell lots of stories and try to convince you that storytelling is a good experience for people in the people business. And as I understand, everybody here, most of you here, are in the people business. And that stories by nature help us make sense out of nonsense. And existence essentially is nonsense. Existence is essentially chaotic. And stories come along, everything from gossip to anecdotes about the job or people on the job, and those stories help us make sense out of our daily routine. So everything we tell, everything we go through has potential to be a story, and I think that's what we want to think about today. I was in a doctor's office a few weeks ago. Doctor's offices are great places to tell stories and to hear stories and to observe stories. They wanted me to take a test. It was a 5 or 6, maybe you've all seen this test. Maybe you had to take it to get into this course. But 5 or 6 tests to give you a personality profile. And I said, well, what's this for? I said, well, they want to know what people my age and my gender and my illness, what we all have in common. You know, 5 pages of yes and no's and truths and falses and things like that. And the first question was, are you sad? Well, if I wasn't sad, I wouldn't be there, right? I got to be sad. I wake up in the morning, read the paper. That starts me off. And they want to know if you're sad all the time, sometimes, most of the time, never. And you got to be careful with answers like that, you know. Say you're sad sometimes because you know from the Dean Martin song, everybody loves somebody sometime. So everybody's got to be sad sometime, right? But you want to never answer the question that, well, you're never sad, because then they lock you right up. They say, well, he's completely loony. Get him right into the wagon and would take him down. And you don't want to be hooked up that you're never sad, because there's no such song as nobody loves nobody never. So you don't have that to trade on. So I worried a little bit about that. Also, another question I asked, do you ever think about dying? Well, you stop and think, well, doesn't everybody? You know what I'm saying? And you think, well, how do I answer a question? Well, true, yeah, I think about dying. Maybe I should not. Do you ever think about illness? Well, I mean, what are you supposed to do in those situations? But as I was leafing through your booklet that is handed out to you in the beginning of the course, I see they have some of those tests in there. So I shouldn't badmouth too many of those multiple choice tests. I did write an essay recently on a multiple choice test that I designed for political correctness. You know, political correctness is a big thing these days, and I understand you all have to be politically correct to be in this course. which is the only prerequisite as I understand, right? And in my test, I drew up, and the test was designed by Be Happy. He's a PhD. He devised a test for measuring PC and CD. PC is political correctness, CD is cultural diversity. And it's a test has 10,000 multiple choice questions. It takes 6 weeks to complete. And it comes with a musical score written by Quincy Jones. The examination is not the standard multiple choice that I've designed. Like ADE, including all the above. The very first question, for example, invites you to pick your mother, which is kind of a clever beginning, I thought. If you get a chance to pick your mother, who would it be? Of course, this section of the test poses a hypothetical question. If you could pick your mother. We all assume you've all had mothers before you take the test. That's a given, right? You are invited to select your mother's hair, color and curl, her race, religion, etc., her skin color, see chart. The color of your skin is always tested by the back of the knee. You gotta look behind your knee to see what color the skin is there. That's the only way you know for sure. So you're invited to select your mother's skin color, her sizes, height, hips, breasts, etc., her level of education, her snuggle quotient, and you have 11 options here from cuddly to daycare. Her age at your birth, her sex quotient. You have 9 degrees here from altruistic to insatiable. At various ages, hers and yours. Her temperament, 17 choices from passive to abusive. Financial assets, etc. It even raises a few questions you'd rather not ask or be asked about your mother. By comparison, the father question, this takes up the morning of the first day, the mother questions. By comparison, the father question takes up only an hour after lunch. Elsewhere in the test, you answer direct questions about race and creed and zip code. In addition, I mentioned the colored chart, the loose flesh. The colored chart offers 7,635 permutations. So you ought to be in there somewhere. So pretty much my attitude towards those multiple choice tests, but it makes a story, right? It makes a story. And I'm looking for stories because nothing else makes any sense to me. Not those tests, for one thing. As I come back into this auditorium, I think of stories because some of my greatest successes, alas, I say, were on this stage. And that was one of the tests I think they asked me a few weeks ago. Name some of your successes. And I heard Joyce talking about successes a few minutes ago. I think she said, if you had named 3, was that 3 successes in the last 5 years? I had 1. But I've forgotten what that one was. But I was invited in here one day. In fact, I was surprised. Last summer, I was at a picnic, and somebody said, I remember the day you came into this auditorium and you quieted the hostile crowd. And I felt good about that. He said, I remember your very words. And he started to tell the story of the day I came in here to quiet the hostile crowd. That's not this group, is it? There's a flashback there. No. And I thought, he's going to tell a great story. He's going to recall those great words. And then he forgot the words. But anyway, I remember the incident because I came in here and the freshmen were there were 1,500 of them roughly in here, 1,300, the seats 1,500. And they had been lectured for several hours now, it seemed, on things they didn't want to hear about the future and the past. And freshmen have no interest in either one. So by the time I came on, they were leaving. Or they were applauding the person who was speaking ahead of me at the wrong time, just to aggravate her. But they were hostile. I mean, they were really hostile. So when I came on, what could I do? Of course, I told them a story. I said, freshmen have always frightened me by the things that they believe to be true. So I told them a story about a freshman who was in my freshman course on writing, I think it was, and they were doing a research paper. And the day before the research paper was due, I always developed some absurdity about the easy things about research papers, about the margins. You know, margins should be so many inches, inch and a half, top on the, what is it, top on the right, and or left, and an inch on the right and the bottom, double space the paper, single space the footnotes, double space between them, all those things. And I was saying that, well, the quality of the paper, I said, you got to be careful of the quality of the paper, because if you buy cheap paper, it's going to turn yellow in about 10, 20 years. And you don't want that to happen. I said, you buy quality rag content. The best paper you can get is 100% rag. And I said, but you can't buy that around here. 50% rag would be all right, and that won't yellow for 500 years. But they don't sell that either. But the bookstore does have 25% rag. So I would recommend you get 25% rag and 16 pound. So the day came for the paper to be due, and the student came in, this young woman, she said, I just don't know if I should turn the paper in or not. I said, what's the problem? She said, no matter what I did, she said, I couldn't get that paper to weigh 16 pounds. So you have visions of this student sitting in this classroom, or sitting in her dormitory room, I should say, with a scale. People come by and say, what are you doing? I'm writing my research paper. And she's weighing this paper, trying to get it to weigh 16 pounds. What must she be doing? You know, paper clips, staples, what is she adding to this? Lead staples, I suppose. And then I told the unruly crowd, they were listening now, they said, he's talking about us. Freshmen love to hear themselves talked about, as we all do, right? So I told them another story about a student I met, the same circumstances, writing a research paper. They said, why are we doing a research paper? Who cares? You know, go through all this material again, rehash this material, and write the footnotes, and so who cares? Nobody cares about that. And I answered this question for about 6 weeks. And finally, I said, all right, what do you want? What do you want out of life with a big L? I gave him the hard question. I want the truth with a big T. Rhymes with P, it stands for pool, right? I said, what do you want out of life? And I was going down the row, and, you know, the uneventful things, they went, I don't know. And finally, this young woman, again, 18 years old, said what she wanted out of life was to get a degree in education, get married, have 2 children, live in Southern California, retire in Florida, and die and be buried in Mount St. Joseph Cemetery in Derby. I didn't know where Derby was. But there was no irony in this voice. I mean, this is a straight story. So that story, again, that's had a soothing effect on the restless freshman. And I began to realize that, as I probably knew a little bit anyway, being in the literature business, the writing business, that stories are the way to soothe the savage beast and to make sense out of all experience. And over the years, to give you other examples of stories, I teach a teaching creative writing course, or any writing course, but this was a creative writing course, and the student was writing a poem, and in the poem was the line, touch cookies, a little image, touch cookies. And you always look for something and say, geez, that's interesting. Everything else was stuff you've seen before. I say, touch cookies, what do you make of that? I mean, I said, well, I meant to say tough cookies, but I mistyped it. So I invented right there on the spot what I call the Touch Cookie Award, which is given to any student whose manuscript is improved as a result of a typographical error. And I've had a few winners over the years. I mean, this is the point about the teaching business, the people business. This is what keeps you going. It's not the paycheck. That's never enough. Right? But it's the stories, always the stories. You stop somebody in the hallway and say, did you hear what happened? These are the things that keep you going. A few years later, I was in a writing course, creative writing course, again it was, short stories they were writing. And I had the opportunity to give the Touch Cookie Award to a young student a woman student who has written a short story about 2 people who had been in love when they were in college but had drifted apart. She had married somebody else. He had married somebody else. He was now divorced, and she was still married to her husband, but he was out of town, and the two of them met at a party. And they talk, small talk, and he asks if he can drive her home. She says, all right. They get to her apartment, they park outside. She says, would you like to come upstairs for a nightgap? And that had to be the Touch Cookie Award of the year. Or the student who misunderstands a word. You tell them to look up words, the new words, and the word cohabitation came up in the reading. So it was a Margaret Mead essay. And so I asked the young man, this was back after the 60s, after the sexual revolution, you may recall. You may recall the sexual revolution. And I said to the young man, I said, you know what the word means, cohabitation? Oh, yeah. I said, well, tell us what it means. Well, I can't quite put it into words. I said, well, have you ever cohabitated? Oh, yeah. I said, with anybody we know? He said, no, I cohabitate alone. Last semester, teaching an art course, I teach in different departments till I find some place that'll let me stay in for a while. You see, each one keeps saying, he doesn't belong here. That's what my mother said, he doesn't belong here. But we're teaching an art course, and the students were learning to talk about paintings. And this one chapter on kitsch, which is bad art. There was a comparison between a Monet nude and a Kavanaugh nude. And the students who were given the oral report on this presentation of these two paintings to try to define for us what constitutes bad art, the one student referred to the Monet woman as a wonton woman. I said that's compared to an egg drop woman, hot and sour woman, I mean, while I'm in last semester I taught for the first time. Once again, I'm still looking for some place to belong. I taught for the first time, probably the last, course on writing comedy. And in one of these stories, a young woman had written, in the class had written a story about a policewoman. And I'm describing the story as she presented it. A big buxom policewoman sees this car speeding, pulls the car over and says to the young man, she says, all right, let's see your condom. The kid says, I don't have a condom. Come on, she says. Don't give me that. I know you got a condom. Let's see the condom. No, 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 he says. I'm not sexually active right now. She said, come on, all you guys from 16 to 52 are sexually active. So I asked the student, I said, how'd you arrive at that number 52? She looked at me knowing she was on the spot. She said, I don't know how long you people can do it. And I said, sometimes I can do it for 2 or 3 minutes. The language is a funny thing, right? And each one of these stories is complete in itself. And at the end of the day, when you hear a story like that, at the end of a semester, you got 4 or 5 stories. And they're not just stories that come from our daily activities, but obviously the world that we move through. Some of you may have seen my essay on the carts on Price Club. Has those new system of putting their carts back underneath some cabana, and you rent them for $0.25 though, right? But I was going there shopping with my wife just before Christmas, and she said, well, we were just looking, she said. But she said, get a cart. You know, the cart's what, they're about the size of this desk, this stage up here. I said, we don't need a cart. I said, we're just looking, remember? So we go into Price Club, and she's got an arm full of batteries, 48 batteries. You know, 12 blank videotapes. And she's walking around like this. She said, go get a cart. So I go out, and it's dark. I don't have my glasses on. So I walk over to the carts. I see them, for some reason, they're all underneath this cabana. And I go over there, and I see they're chained together, and I can't figure out how to get them apart. I'm shaking the cart and pulling the chain. I can't get them apart. So I go back inside. Now she's got a 42-pound box of Tide. 3 gallons of ketchup. She says, get a cart. This, by the way, passes for meaningful conversation in our relationship. Again, I go back out. What can I do, right? I'm just the errand boy. And this time, I see a young man with the cart. He's a man, young man, about 13, maybe 14. I come up to him and I say, he's still got stuff in it, and I say, he's just unloaded it. I watched him unload it and put it in the trunk of his car with his parents. He was walking away from there. I said, I'll take the cart. He looked at me and he said, you know, are you crazy? He's thinking I'm going to assault him, right? I'm going to steal his cart. And I said, yeah, I'll take the cart. No. He said, what about my quarter? And I'm thinking, now I got to pay the kid a quarter for the cart? So he soon explains to me that that's the new system here. You go over, you put a quarter in, you disengage the chain, and the cart's yours. Until you bring it back, plug it together, and you get your quarter back. He explains this to me, and I understand. I'm not stupid. Maybe. So I go back inside now with a cart, and wiser, because now I know something about the future. And I can't find my wife. I look among the tires. She's nowhere to be found. So I leave the cart, and I walk off to get my wife. I come back, the cart's gone. It's a true story, I understand. This is a tragedy I'm telling you, and you're laughing. So I go to a man who's in charge. You ever try finding somebody who's in charge of Price Club? So I finally find somebody with the watches. There's always somebody with the watches. So I go over there, and I say, somebody stole my cart. You know, he looked at me as if I was a grown man asking for where's the little boy's room, you know. So you're a big guy, what's the problem here? So you're out a quarter, what's the problem? He said, well, he said, take somebody else's. This didn't seem to be the way to run a commercial establishment. So I said, what do you mean take somebody else? He said, well, the one over there, take the one over there. And he points towards the cart, and I walk over and look at the cart, and inside the cart there are some three dozen Hershey bars and 6 dozen tube socks. I said, this is somebody's cart. The guy says, take the stuff out and put it on the counter and take the cart. Well, I got out of there in a hurry. I went down and I found my wife. She was among the tires. I said, we're getting out of here. This is a lunatic asylum here. And so she had to drop the tires. She had 8 of them. They're having a 2-for-1 special, I guess. And she thought I was making, just making it all up. But when I wrote that story up, the only thing I added to it, because the story told itself, right? I mean, I just told you what happened. I didn't make up anything. I realized that it was a sign of not only the future, but a sign of the times. So my opening paragraph when I wrote the story was this: if God had to do the Garden of Eden over again, he or she would ask Adam and Eve for a security deposit. Everybody wants the money up front. They want to trust it up front, right? Anyway, so we're in the business of storytelling here, and trying to impress upon you that the value of storytelling, each one of those is complete in itself, and funny. They don't have to be funny, but they can be as well. And to experience with them is to experience something that's whole, something that's complete, and there's some release from that. I suggest from what you're after here. You're released from life stresses. Did I hear you had some stress before? Joyce had stress because you were running out of time? Oh, never mind, I won't. Philip Roth says that burden isn't that everything in life has to be a book, but that it doesn't count as much until it is a book. I would go a little step further and say everything in life, nothing counts in life until it can be a story. And then once you can make it into a story, then life becomes a little more palatable. In the meantime, you keep looking for stories to tell. Years ago, I gave the final lecture several years for the Sex Institute that was held on this campus. And I believe it's the same as it is now, that they still get 6 credits for Sex Institute and you get 3 credits here? It's harder work over there, though. And you got to be under 52. But just lecturing to the Sex Institute gives me a dozen stories to tell. And a few years from now, or maybe next week, lecturing at this institute will give me some stories to tell. I don't know if you're familiar with the Sex Institute. Anybody here been in the Sex Institute? I know you can't raise your hand. Too weak. Yeah? Sure. You took it 3 times, right? Finally got that D she was after. By the end of the institute, the students have slogged their way through hours and hours of sex films. The kind of educational films that make Leave It to Beaver look pornographic. They've been sensitized and desensitized in that group, and because they witnessed sexual positions they thought only circus performers engaged in. They heard words that were once mortal sins. They learned to speak these words, and they got 6 hours credit. So what I did is I just gave the final lecture when, after 2 weeks of seeing these kinds of film, the group is now sliding dangerously towards celibacy. And they needed me to come in and put the brakes on. So come on back. And tell them that, yes, people were still wearing underwear, and life could go on. So I would show them old film clips that would suggest to them that an orgasm was something like a slow pan to a lace curtain being lifted gently by a breeze as a train whistle calls in the distance, and we have a zoom camera towards the door. They weren't satisfied with that. I even brought in June Allison and Dick Powell, but they weren't satisfied with that. But it was a story, and we still got stories, still make up stories about that institute. One joke, I never tell jokes because I don't know, I haven't told any jokes yet. But this is a stolen joke anyway. I happened to see it on the Improv one night. It's related to the sex in the movies here. One woman was saying, comedian was telling the joke. She said, "Do you realize that all the sounds we make during sex are sounds we have learned from the movies? That the sounds that we make, we feel those are the sounds we ought to make because we learned that from the movies." She said, "I never realized the significance of this until I dated a guy who had never been to a movie." Have to stop and think about that one. But anyway, these institutes are going to combine next year, right? The HELP and the Sex Institute, and we're going to be called SHLEP. One of the ways we can anchor a story into a more philosophical angle and into a tradition of health, mental health, for example, in the Freudian tradition, in the psychoanalytical tradition, is to touch on a American philosopher like Richard Rorty, who sees Freud's contribution to the 20th century simply as that he teaches everybody how to tell a story about himself. And that psychoanalysis is no more than that. And that's the only contribution Freud has made to the 20th century, is that he has realized the importance of storytelling. That the way to find the cure for your neurosis is to find that story that you can tell about yourself that satisfies you. And when it doesn't satisfy you, you rewrite the story. That's all. You just keep rewriting the story. Rorty, the philosopher, R-O-R-T-Y, and I use him only because his name sounds a bit like mine. That Rorty believes that the poets are the heroes of the future, the heroes really of our time, and that language is the business you should be in. I don't think do you have language in your HELP? No, L is for laughter, right? There's no language in there anywhere. Let's just stand back and look at the word help. But language is the source, is the where you turn for a cure. And as you can develop that language, even a single word, if you can once you start putting words to something, you are on the way to getting a hold of it in a linguistic sense, at least, and that hold on it. That hold on irrationality is the beginning of the cure. And when you get to comic stories, one nice thing about comedy is that it doesn't take anything seriously. You can tell a story about anything. It doesn't allow you then to go into life and say, well, this is more important than that. It just simply says, hey, whatever makes you laugh is what we're going to tell the story about. So we're interested primarily in stories today here that are comic, and many of the stories in my Ort brand are comic. There is a variation in there, for example, the Touch Cookie Award, one essay in here, a story that it's called it's called, what's it called? They Shoot Messages, don't they? Talking about the Touch Cookie Award, I was in a Chinese restaurant once and received for my fortune cookie a typographical error in the cookie. And that's a disturbing notion, right? To have your future foretold and there's a typographical error. You wonder, who was it who sabotaged you? Was it Confucius? Was it the translator of Confucius? Was it the waiter? Because if it was, you don't have to tip him. If he messes up your future, you don't have to tip the waiter. One of my rules. But the fortune cookie read like this. It says, you will take a change on something in the future. And you know what's worse? I got that fortune cookie again. Just recently I got it. I think they got them all back to this Chinese restaurant and said, he's out there, he's out there. Bring out the bad fortune cookie. So when you get a fortune cookie essay that gives you a typographical error, you're a little bit concerned. You've got a murky future as it is. And now you get a message about the future, and it's incomprehensible. And once you start to sort through it, I'm reading a little bit from my book here. So sort of through this murky future, I discovered still another possibility, that the error perhaps did not hinge on printing change instead of chance. In other words, did it want to say, really, you're going to take a chance on the future? Maybe take had been substituted for make. You're going to make a change on the future. You know, wait a minute. And then you say, well, maybe that's not the typographical error. Maybe on should be in the future. Maybe something should be nothing. You know, you start playing around like that, and you find out how scary it is to be not only in the language business, but telling stories. So be careful of fortune cookies with typographical errors. Another interesting story I had along the way, another true story actually, and we begin to move now a little bit on how to make experience into stories. I was in a restaurant in Los Angeles, just outside Los Angeles, up on the hillside. My wife and I were sitting there, and it was a fancy place, a place where they park your car and you come in, you know. And most people were driving, had a chauffeur-driven car. And I never like to go to a restaurant that charges more than $6 for anything. So I mean, I'll pay $8 if the food's really good. Some people call me tight. So we're in this restaurant, and it's kind of a fancy place. You have a 360-degree view of the countryside, and it's a little hill. And the waiter comes over and wants to know what we'll have, and salad, and what kind of dressing you want on the salad. And I said, well, what do you recommend? Well, he recommends, I think it was honey mustard, he called it. I said, what is that? How is that? He said, well, it's good dressing. If you don't like it, we'll take it back and get something else, that's all. I said, all right, I'll try the honey mustard. So my wife always hates to take me into these places because she knows I've already winced because I'm over $6. And the waiter comes back, and he serves the salad, the honey mustard dressing, and he comes back with a plate. I know you've never had this experience. I've never run across anybody who's had this experience. Tell me if I'm wrong here. And on the plate, flat plate, is a cloth napkin, and he unfolds the napkin, and lying on the napkin are 2 forks. And I said to him, he's holding it to me. I said, what's that for? He said, well, it's a chilled fork. I said, a what? He said, it's a chilled fork. I said, well, what do I do with it? He said, well, some people like the sensation. I said, where do they stick it? Well, my wife crawls under the table at this point, hiding behind her napkin. And he comes back later and he says, how was the honey mustard? And I said, it was fine until the fork got warm. And that's exactly the way I played it. Those are the words I gave at the time. And you got to be, in those situations, prepared to see the potential. You can't be determined by the situation and say, well, you're supposed to behave in a certain way, right? You're supposed to recognize that you are in a fancy restaurant, and fancy restaurant people eat fancily. So what you do when you tell a story like that, though, you realize you can't tell the whole story. I mean, there are many other things going on in the background, and we don't get really a picture of the waiter here. He's not a major player. The only picture you have of me is me here. You hear my voice telling it. I don't tell you how if the waiter's feelings are hurt, or if he's insulted, or if he's laughing, or whatever. So as you tell a story, what you do is you pare life down a little bit. Stories force that upon you. It says if you're going to make this into a story, you have to pare it down a little bit. You have to make it a piece of gossip, maybe, or a joke, or an anecdote, and you're going to give it a point of view. But each one of those parings down is a way of shaving off the parts that don't seem to have purpose. They don't seem to fit your needs. And as you do that, you give them, those parts that you do put in, a sense of purpose. And again, getting that sense of purpose is where the value of the story lies. Because it is difficult at times to look around in life and find the purpose for things. And I would, often we would all have different views on this, but I would go even further and say, well, because you can't find a purpose, there isn't any purpose. I mean, you're foolish to think there is. But stories always have purpose. And everything in the story has a purpose. And as you tell it, you realize even the pauses have purposes. And because they have purposes, you are experiencing then a sense of wholeness there, a sense of completeness, a sense of, hey, I feel as if I'm someplace at rest because I don't have to worry about things being extra. I don't have to stop the storyteller and say, wait a minute, whatever happened to that boy that stole the cart from? You know, he's not part of the story. He's a minor player. He drifts off and nobody really cares about him. And he may have gone over and said, boy, there might be another story over there, right? He says, you should see the guy I just met. He doesn't know about the quarters, living in another century. So you listen to all kinds of stories, you see the potential for stories, and then you try to select them. And there are some stories that are hard to tell. Some stories that come out in bad taste, and you might want to tell them in some audiences and not in front of other audiences. Joyce has assured me you can tell this audience anything. And they've been hearing anything so far, right? There was a friend of mine who was dying about a year ago, this was. Elderly woman, had been sick for some time, and in her late 80s, and was dying. And we were very close. And we got a call one night saying that she looked as if this was the time. So we rushed over there, and she was in pain and couldn't breathe and lying on the bed, and her son-in-law was there and daughter. And she kept saying, oh, Dan, so good to see you, so good to see you. I'm in my final stages. When I heard that phrase, you know, I'm in my final stages, I said, where do you get a phrase like that? That's a piece of language, right? She's playing in my ballpark now. The final stages. She kept saying it over again. Oh, I'm in the final stages, I'm in the final stages. And there was, in her dying there was a comic element to all that I was only appreciating because as being in there as a storyteller, what you always do, you have distance. You always have distance. You can be close and you can be back at the same time. And you can see it from this angle over here, this angle over here. And you see for all its potential, all the things it might be. And she had difficulty breathing and in pain. And finally, she was at rest for a few minutes, and I said, well, I'll go out and get sandwiches for everybody, and I'll be back. So I went out and got sandwiches, and I came back. By that time, my wife had given her a pain pill, which had relieved some of her pain and her anxiety. And she was sitting up in bed. Entirely different person. Breathing and eating a McDonald's French fry, which eventually was traced to be the killer. Which is something I just thought of. There's always potential for another angle on the story down the line, right? But I'm trying to tell the story straight as it is, and this is a true story. She's sitting up in bed now, talking about how she had spent the last week in the hospital, and the people who came in the next bed were the nicest people. The whole family was in to see this woman who was very ill, she said. And the son was there, and the son-in-law was there, and the daughter was there, and the sister was there, and they were all the nicest people, she said. And they just did everything for me, got me a drink of water, and so on and so on. And this woman, she said, this woman in the bed next to me, she said she was really sick. She was really sick. She was really in the final stages, she said. Now here she was, she already had distanced herself from that final stage, and she now was playing the word game. She realized that she had been believing that she was in the final stages before, and now, from a distance, she could say, that woman over there who was dying, she's in the final stages. And she was playing the word game, and playing the storytelling game, playing the distancing game, and the story could end there, or I could tell you that she died 24 hours later. But depends what kind of, either way, it's a story, and you can make it as a funny story, or a tragic story, or whatever, depending on what you want to emphasize or what you can tolerate. The other stories that come up in this context are stories that might be seen as in bad taste. And again, as I say, Joyce says there's no such thing as bad taste in this group. A friend of mine who is allergic to seafood was telling me two stories about getting sick with seafood. I don't know, I've never gotten sick with seafood. Anybody here who has, I guess, a terrible thing here. A lot of vomiting and so on. We take a drink of water. Skim milk. Anyway, he gets deathly ill very quickly. And they were at a New Year's Eve party in a bar, and they were munching all kinds of different things. And it was midnight, a little later, and he had bitten into a piece of seafood he didn't expect. Suddenly he's getting sick. He said, we got to get out of here. So he and his wife quickly leave. They get out to the parking lot. He says, I'm not going to make it. He's going to have diarrhea right there. Right? So she says, you hold my coat. He says to her, you hold my coat. He opens the car door, and she holds his coat, and he does what he has to do. A police car pulls in, points the lights right at this situation, which looks a little mysterious. The wife, recognizing authority when she sees it, leaves him, walks over to the car. Walks over to the policeman with a coat in her hand to explain the situation. The headlights are on the poor guy who can't move. Now, this has got to be a tragic story, right? Yet, don't eat the seafood. That's all. There are other stories that come along that can be unpleasant stories in a variety of other contexts. But I would say, I don't know if it's necessary to avoid unpleasant stories, because the value is in the storytelling, and there's always an imaginative element, because language, once you're in the language business, you're away from truth. See, truth is not worth dealing with. It's a reality principle, right? Truth is unforgiving. So who wants to hit it head on all the time? A story, on the other hand, is by its very nature a lie, simply because you put it into words, right? If you put it into words, it can't be the truth, because as you experienced it, words were only a part of the experience. Your eyes were involved, your hearing was involved, your sense of smell was involved, your sense of space, and so on. So you don't worry too much about fabrication, because it's just going to be there, and somebody's going to be insulted. Probably with every one of those stories, somebody's going to feel sorry for the waiter who gets abused by the chilled fork repartee. I have an essay coming out soon on baseball. I'm complaining about baseball players making so much money. With $50,000 a swing they make, $15 million a year, it's just whatever, making outrageous sums. And so I wrote a satirical essay on how they are now, you know, they sell their autographs for $12, $18 a signature. And now I write an essay about how they are going to package the spit. You ever wonder what at the bottom of the dugout, what that looks like down there? Well, it's a brown, tarry substance. But they have discovered now that you can package that. And for $19.95, you can get in a ball, now called a spitball, you can get inside the ball the spit of your hero. You can have, it costs you a little extra money, but you can have that spit, that Bobby Thompson spit, just before you hit that home run. You can have that, there's even a chemical breakdown of that spit. Now that might be a story seen in bad taste. My brother thought that story was in bad taste. But I published it in a magazine called Exquisite Corpse, which publishes only stuff in bad taste, which also published my PCCD test. But we don't duck stories that are in bad taste, because the value is in the story, not in the level of acceptance. You might want to be careful who you're telling the story to, so you don't get punched in the nose. but I don't worry too much about it. We ran a little late. We're running a little late to start with, so I'm running a little late. That's all right?
Run a little late.
Run a little late. I don't have much more to say anyway. I did promise Joyce that I would read a story from the book. First of all, I can read the story now about the cat because the cat died. Last time I read the story about the cat, she sued me. He sued me. He sued me. But the opening paragraph is in that sheet that was handed out there, that colored sheet that apparently distinguishes me in your booklet as one of the speakers. That also says I'm responsible for the line, male craxies don't sit eggs, right? Yeah. Everybody knows that. But the opening line there is worth looking at, I think, because it helps to establish the voice of what you're telling. When you're telling a story, you start to tell the story, right away you give your listener or your reader some sense of where you're coming from. And the reader then knows he's in some familiar territory. This is very important. I think about this because I teach courses in the movies all the time. Again, I tell you, I keep looking for some place to belong. I teach courses in the movies, and I had an epiphany last week. I knew I wanted to tell you something. I had an epiphany last week. You know what an epiphany is? No, I don't know either. I don't know what it is either. But anyway, I was driving, I turned down the street, and a school bus turned down the street towards me about 200 yards away. And suddenly, for about 4 or 5 seconds, I was convinced that in that school bus, there was some danger for me. That bus was armed with terrorists, explosives, and they were out to kill me. Now you say, well, it's simple paranoia, right? But what it was is for 4 or 5 seconds, I was so caught up by the music on the car radio that the car radio music was providing a soundtrack to my life. And the music on the car radio had put me in a movie for 4 or 5 seconds. I said, this guy's real loony, right? Have you ever been inside a movie? See, it's very important to know what kind of movie you are in, if you're in a movie, right? I mean, if you're in that movie and you're headed towards the school bus, it could be Schwarzenegger in the bus. It could be some comedian, right? It could be Bill Cosby. And if it was Bill Cosby, you wouldn't worry so much. If it's Schwarzenegger, you're not sure he's, well, you know he's not real. And you might be impressing him by your body. You might be able to show him your muscles too. That'll scare him off. But you got to know what kind of movie you're in. The same way you got to know what kind of story you're in. And I did write an essay about that experience with the school bus, realizing that as you go through life, when you start out going to movies, you can't separate reality from the movies because you're just a child. You know, a train looks like a train. And then you begin to make the distinction. And then you begin to realize there are certain things that happen in certain kinds of movies. Some movies you never take a shower. Some movies you never back down a hallway. Some movies you never go out at night. I mean, you got to know what kind of movie you're in. And then ideally that knowledge carries over into life. So when you write a story or tell a story, it's the same kind of situation. And this story about the cat, it was 3 a.m., I say, right in the paragraph you had with you. I was 3 a.m. and I was happily suspended where sleep is like a tomb. Still, I sensed a stirring, a presence there in the abstracted dark, a shape tilting over me. Up to that point, you see, we could be in a mystery situation. We could be in a dangerous situation. I heard the rasping scream before I was fully awake. Get out of here. Get out of this bed. I shot up, a lightning bolt returning to its maker. I stumbled into the right shoe and the wrong pants leg. Right there you figure, nobody's going to get hurt here, right? And hopped halfway out of the bedroom before I realized my wife was only yelling at the cat. Even when I'm awake, I can be confused by that singular tone she reserves for both me and the cat. Joyce had wanted me to read the Father of the Bride essay in here. She wanted me to read the second one, the Father of the Bride, again. I had another marriage. I have nothing but daughters, unfortunately. And now they're all gone, fortunately. And I have their dogs. I actually am watching the dogs right now. In fact, these are not the pants I started off with today. They have mud all over them. But there are a couple essays I wrote on the father of the bride, being the father of the bride. You may have seen the movie. It was an awful movie, I thought. The essays are better. Anyway, and I had another wedding this past summer, but I no longer laugh. I've gotten over the laughing. I've gotten over the crying. I'm insensitive at this point. But this was the first one, and if you read the book, if you buy the book, you can read the second one, I guess. Joyce liked the second one. The second one she said she liked so much she cried and cried and laughed and laughed. Was that it, Joyce? And she felt a lot of stress. And then suddenly the stress went away, and she said, I think I'll form a help institute. It was St. Augustine had the same revelation the same way. St. Augustine, he started the Sex Institute. I can say that about St. Augustine because he's not here anymore. But the father of the bride is a barometer of social change. Let me just read you that one. This is the father of the bride. I am the only one who knows that our daughter's wedding plans have our household in a terrorist's grip. I am being held hostage. The powers communicate with me by notes magnetized to the refrigerator. Call the cake lady. Tell her white and lemon. They eliminated me from the decision-making process when, to all of their plans, I kept responding, you gotta be kidding. Who needs flowers at a wedding? The joy of the young couple should be blossoms enough. The smile on my face, I rented a smile for the occasion, will be a garden of delights. The dimples in my wife's cheeks will be a rose and a rose and a rose. My wife, back when we were still speaking to each other, told me how much she should expect, or we should expect, to spend on flowers. I said, you got to be kidding. My wife has on her side the perverse wisdom that the flowers are a minor expense. I know they think I'm just a tightwad, a cheapskate, and a hard-hearted cynic. I never used to pay much attention to that traditional image of the father of the bride as a clown performing on the edge of a circus. But I now know that the father of the bride is a barometer of social change. It's not just a matter of being stingy and unsentimental. We are pivots in the social order, seers of the future, monitors of the social mores, prophets without profit. Did I mention we are doing the whole production? The wedding will make Rogers and Hammerstein's South Pacific like Gilligan's Island. My friend Tony wants me to videotape the whole production so when his daughter gets married, he can run the tape and dance to my music. Who would have expected that my kid with the Alice Cooper posters would want such an elaborate traditional affair? Somewhere I lost a generation between me and my children. I should have been more sensitive to times they are changing. When Bob Dylan was born again, I should have taken that as a sign. An intimate gathering is now defined as the Beatles at Shea Stadium, or the Pope saying Mass outdoors. So we rented a hall and hired a band. We mugged a friend to do the calligraphy for the invitations, blackmailed another friend to take the photographs, and second mortgaged the house to buy postage stamps. I was sent on the errand for the stamps. The message was cryptic: get love stamps. A week later, when I took them out of my wallet, I discovered that love means sticking together. They accused me of trying to sabotage the wedding calendar, that daily checklist of madness. Do you have any idea what it costs to stuff a chicken these days? I was attracted to Cocktail Frank bits because it sounded like somebody I went to college with. But my wife argued that when out-of-town people come to the wedding, they expect to be served a hot meal. I don't know whose idea it was to hire the caterer. My wife's original notion was that she, with the help of her neighbors, would prepare the feast and we would serve dinner in the backyard with the gypsy moths. The cake maker said she could construct any design for the top of the wedding cake. I argued for Hostess Twinkies, decorated with high school pictures of the bride and the groom. My wife said I should wait in the car. My daughter wanted to have a traditional wedding figurine surrounded by 3-story pillars under a neoclassic roof. Around the edges, she wanted live vegetation. The price of the cakes led me to believe that the cake maker had hired an architect and for the decorative pillars planned to use stone chips from the real Acropolis. I remember when my daughter, back when we were still speaking to each other, told me she wanted an open bar. I said, "You got to be kidding." I argued for cake beer. "Summer weddings make you hot and thirsty," I said. "Beer drinkers love summer weddings and vice versa. Beer drinkers have more fun," I said. Eventually, I backed down to a softer position, wine and beer. It was a nightmare sitting at the bargaining table with my wife and daughter. They had both learned negotiating from the Viet Cong. His family drinks scotch, so I allowed for a bottle of scotch. His friends drink vodka, so I allowed for a bottle of vodka. The word "his" came to have the toll of kismet. An open bar is defined as a hole in the wedding ceremony into which everyone pours the father of the bride. When my package store dealer told me what I could expect for an open bar, I thought he was counting an Italian lira. My daughter and my wife take turns telling each other to ignore anything I say, but I have made some progress. Last week, I got my wife to realize that she didn't have to buy all the wedding presents herself. There's every reason to believe I assured her that the invited guests will also bring them. My daughter and I went around and around about the music. She couldn't appreciate why I objected to hiring a band. She thinks her father is just being cheap, but it's not that. It's just that musicians as a group are unsavory. They make lovely music for ceremonies, but deep down they are unhappy people. I volunteered to play records or lead sing-alongs. My daughter says her friends can't dance to "On Top of Old Smoky." Like I was saying, somewhere between me and my daughter, we've lost a generation. Not too long ago, people were getting married while skydiving. They recited vows from Mao Zedong's Red Book or the Sears and Roebuck catalog. But our kids today want to get married the way we did in the 50s, and that's a culture shock for us parents, a kind of time warp jet lag. While we were out buying the designer jeans and stenciled t-shirts of the youth generation, our kids were making plans to get fitted for tuxedos and wedding gowns. Somewhere our generations passed going in the opposite directions. Last night I tried to explain this to my wife and daughter. I told them that I'm sentimental, that the bills are making me cry. But I am more concerned with the social upheaval epitomized by Led Zeppelin fans getting married in churches. My wife and daughter sang in chorus, "You got to be kidding." I think I am speaking plain English, but nobody understands me. Thank you.
Why I did not mention his previous novel, which really was marvelous and which I did read when it came out. The reason I make a point of not mentioning that novel was because in the divorce agreement, my ex-husband got his book. Now I
page 46 missing.
Oh, not true. Dan, actually, you have to know what a great talent he is, that he not only interests people in literature and film and apparently now art and sex, but I asked him to be a part of our institute because I knew what a really bright, clever, witty teacher he is, what a magnificent writer he is, and all this despite the fact that he is still my ex-husband's closest friend. Now, Dan, it should be noted, because as Dan points out, everything really in life that matters is a story. Dan, on one occasion in my own life, when I was still in my first life with Marty, had apparently visited our yard while we were asleep. And we at the time had a rather poor septic system. And it had overflowed on a number of occasions, and the smell was known throughout the entire neighborhood, to the point that I thought our house was either floating down the street or an eviction notice would appear in our mailbox. And one morning we wake up, and there, in this area that we had carefully tilled to make a vegetable garden, which had now overflowing fields, leaching fields in it, was a sign on a big piece of wood shaped this way in white, painted with red letters saying, "Help," with a hand coming out of the dirt. This was the work of Dr. Dan Ort.